Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our conversation of Virgil's Aeneid to book 12, the culminating book of the Aeneid and the last book of our three important epics. We'll have more to say about that at the conclusion of this lecture. This book is called The Sword Decides All, because of course we're going to have the final fight scene between finally Aeneas and Turnus. We've been waiting for this for some time. Hey, let me just pause for a moment and congratulate you on being able to make it to this moment. I know that there are a few of you who have worked really hard to try to get all of the readings done for the Iliad, the Odyssey, and now the Aeneid as well. And I just want to tell you how proud I am of you that you have committed to try and do that. That is no small feat. It's kind of like, weightlifters who try to, acquire a certain kind of bench press mark or something like that. I mean, it's impressive that you've done it. Now we'll turn. We finally will see the final fight scene. This is Aeneas versus Turnus. Of course, this is going to remind us of Achilles versus Hector, or Odysseus versus the suitors. We're going to ask questions about the ending of this poem that of course is intentionally designed on the ending of the Iliad and the Odyssey, no question. But we're also going to ask specifically about, well, Aeneas will kill Turnus at the end, but is he, Aeneas, a hero or a villain for doing it? Huge debate in the scholarship about this topic, and we'll enjoy the debate hopefully at the end. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, definitely recommend you do that. Get a hold of the AP folder there. I'm assuming that you have watched or studied with me all of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the books of the Aeneid. Let's review those quickly one last time, as we have done in previous final lectures of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. In book 1, you'll be reminded that Juno will wreck Aeneas' ships. At Carthage we are. He meets Dido, of course, and we have that interesting then relationship that is developed between Aeneas and Dido. In book 2 we have the fall of Troy, which is significant because we're going to have the fall of another city, and at the conclusion of the Aeneid here we have we're told about how it happens with the lying of Sinon. We have the horse, we have Pyrrhus, who will kill Priam. This is a significant reference as well, because at the conclusion of the Aeneid we have two fighters in Aeneas and Turnus who fight very much like Pyrrhus, we're told, when he gets inside the walls of Troy. In book 3 we have the conclusion of the fall of Troy, and as well we have what happens when they all leave and start sailing for they do not know where. Anchises, however, we're told, does die in Sicily, and that's the end of the story of Aeneas. To Dido. Of course, Dido is totally in love because of the shenanigans of Aeneas' mother, Venus. We will, in book 4, have the tragic love story of Dido, the fall of Dido. And it's at this moment we probably need to write down to just pay attention to all of the women, female characters, both goddesses as well as human characters who are women in this poem, and of course all three of the poems of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. The way these female characters are treated going to be significant in some of our comments at the end. Dido, of course, will kill herself. Amata, at the end of book 12 here, the queen of the city, will kill herself as well, so we'll have some similar kinds of carryover as well. Aeneas goes on in book 5 to Sicily. We have the funeral games for Anchises, his father. Anchises will be mentioned, interestingly, at the very end of this book as well. We have the women burning the ships to try and say, let's just stay here. And then finally Aeneas sailing with a few of his sailors towards Italy. In book 6, we have, of course, the famous journey to the underworld, where, for the last time with Anchises, we have some conversation about the future. The future, of course, meaning Rome. And, of course, that will be significant, the way that this book is going to end, because this poem is going to end, and book 12 is going to end. Because we will have an exchange between Juno and Jove, where Jove will say, look, this is the way it's got to go down, and Juno will say, I agree, but we'll get to it. In book 7, of course, Aeneas is with Latinus. We will see Latinus several times now in this book. Latinus, of course, is going to say, I am ready to give my daughter Lavinia to Aeneas because I've gotten this omen that says this is the way things got to go down. It's Juno and Electra, of course, that fury that ultimately will send all kinds of problems into Queen Amata's heart, Turnus's heart, and of course Lavinia then is this kind of bizarre, shadowy character. We all know that we're fighting for her, the way, of course, Helen is the start, supposedly, of the fight at Troy, but never really does she speak. In Book 8, we have Aeneas going to Evander, and of course Pallas, his son, will be included. We will have Venus asking Vulcan to provide Aeneas with his shield. That will be significant because it will be, in the end, that armor that's created that will be the reason that Aeneas is able to defeat Turnus. In Book 9, we have Turnus's Aristeia, that term that we used. That's the first of several in his beginning to kill. While Aeneas is away, Turnus will attack the ramparts. Nicias and Euryalus will both go out as friends in the night, and they will die. And of course, we have that tragic, tragic moment when Euryalus' mother on the rampart walls realizes that is her son's head at the end of a stick, all of that. In Book 10, we have the Gods' Council, and finally the decision is made by Jove. I'm going to let this thing play out. We all know in the end, and that's significant, because as we've said before, we know how the Iliad is going to end. Hector's going to get jacked. We know how the Odyssey is going to end. The suitors are going to get jacked. We know how the Aeneid is going to end. Turnus is going to get jacked. In every poem, we know the outcome, and yet the poet has the ability to create tension, both Homer and Virgil, in these poems, to at least make us want to keep watching how the NASCAR wreck is going to happen. Turnus will kill Pallas and put on Pallas's belt. That will be significant in the same way Hector putting on Patroclus's armor, which is of course Achilles' armor, will be that pivotal moment in the Iliad that tells us we know how this thing is going to end up ending in the end. Mezentius and his son are both killed at the conclusion of Book 10. In Book 11, we have the funeral pyres that are burning. We have Latinus and his council. We have Drances versus Tunis. And finally, we have Camelia, who is this amazing warrioress who will fight and then ultimately die. And it's pretty clear to the Latins that things are going sideways at this point, which leads us finally to Book 12. Let's briefly now remind you that the hope is you're reading this material on your own and then using me as a way to kind of help you understand it better. Again, our learning theory is the quest to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. In our learning theory, in our annotative theory, we do that with asking three guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? Summary. At level 2, what does the text mean? Here at 2A, themes, messages. And at 2B, we're asking throughout all of these series of lectures, we've asked specifically rhetorically to focus on two things: symbolism and irony. And of course, we're going to finish this poem with all kinds of a lot of both. Finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate this information to stuff I already know? At 3A, we're relating specifically to the Iliad and the Odyssey because we've done our study of it. And some of you will have been saying and will continue to say, it's amazing how this poem, the Aeneid, really does borrow heavily from the Iliad and the Odyssey. You wouldn't really understand that unless you've actually read those poems, and you start to get a feel at the end in the Book 12 work here that that's the case. And of course, there's comparisons that we make. 24 books of the Iliad, 24 books of the Odyssey, only 12 books. It's basically Virgil's attempt to say, I'm half as good as Homer. Of course, there's always been the argument, St. Augustine felt like, Virgil was a far superior poet to either Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey. Finally, at level 3B, we ask, can I own this material in some way, and ask questions that become questions for me personally. I hope that I can help you do that one more time here. Now, again, all three of these epic poems struggle with the question, I say struggle, certainly introduce and struggle, with the question of what I have called in these lectures the blame game. Who is responsible for all of the suffering and pain that is in the world? Again, the question is, do we get what we deserve? And in the end, does Turnus get what he deserves? This will continue to be the question that we will ask. And by the way, this question won't go away in our AP study. We will come back to it again and again. We'll come back to it when we do Dante's Inferno. We will come back to it when we do Milton's Paradise Lost. We will come back to it when we do T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Let's do now a real brief summary of Book 12, as we have done before, and then we'll get into the actual lines. The book opens with Turnus speaking to Latinus and saying, okay, I recognize that this is insanity. I'll fight Aeneas, and whoever wins gets Lavinia, and it's over. Latinus says this is a bad idea, and Latinus's wife, Amata, will say this is a bad idea. In fact, she goes so far as to say, you're my only hope, so we can't have you die. Sounding very much like Priam and Hecuba talking to Hector right before he decides to have his one-on-one contest with Achilles. We know how that ends up. We also get this really interesting moment right at the end at line 86 where we're told that Lavinia, the girl that both Aeneas and Turnus are fighting for, that at line 86 she blushes, and that this just consumes Turnus with love for her, which convinces him that he's got to keep going. They make a peace pact, they all get together, they have these really important ceremonies, these religious ceremonies where everybody swears that they're not going to fight anymore. But then we're told Juno gets involved at line 270, and what do you know? Turnus, it turns out, has a sister, and Juturna. And Juturna is this interesting goddess type. She was raped by Jove and then turned into a goddess, but she can come. Turnus recognizes her as her sister, and she is going to get involved. And the first thing that she does is to sow discord, just like Alecto earlier. She sows discord, and immediately we've got a javelin, a spear that gets thrown. One of 9 brothers gets killed, and now we're right back at it again. This sounding, of course, very much like the Iliad, and how Hera will come down and convince Padrus that he needs to shoot that arrow, and we get it all started again. The peace pact is the moment it's created, it's broken. We think in the history of the world how often that happens. And the slaughter is immense. Aeneas, by the way, is hurt by an arrow, and he has to be healed by his own mother. That's sounding very similar to the Iliad as well. Aeneas then decides, fine, I've had enough. And with the suggestion of his mother Venus, he attacks the actual city. And it's at this point that Turnus will say, enough, let's fight. We then will have this interesting exchange between Jove and Juno. Jove at line 840 will have his famous scales. We saw these scales in the Iliad. We will see these scales again, interestingly, in Milton's great epic, Paradise Lost, when we come to study that. Juno will say, all right, I'm done, enough. But she says, when this thing is over and Aeneas has won and Turnus is dead, you have to agree with me that we won't call them Trojans, we're going to call them Latians. Is that okay? And Jove says, absolutely. In fact, we're told he smiles. It's almost as if the gods could care less that so much brutal destruction, slaughter has occurred. Yeah, no problem. The final fight scene, very similar in many ways to the Iliad 22. Turnus's sword will break because it's not actually his sword. He has one accidentally from his driver, and he doesn't have his own sword. And so when he swings it against the armor of Aeneas, it shatters. He then runs. He then will throw a boulder. This will remind us of Hector's huge boulder in Iliad 12. In fact, it's an interesting mnemonic because it's 12. We're told 12 men couldn't pick this boulder up, and yet Aeneas can pick it up, right? He throws it, but his knees buckle and he can't throw it far enough. Finally, Aeneas will throw the spear that wounds Turnus. Turnus will then beg for his life. We will read the final lines of this poem then and critique it as has been so often done, because Turnus will beg for his life and remind Aeneas he had a father, Anchises, and will remind Aeneas that Turnus himself has a father, and please let me go back to my dad. This will, of course, remind us of the final lines of Iliad 24, when, of course, Priam will remind Aeneas, or Achilles, of Peleus, his father, right? Well, Aeneas, we're told, is torn, and he almost is ready to let Turnus go and this thing be done, because Turnus has said, you get the girl. When all of a sudden he sees that belt strap, that was Pallas's belt strap across the shoulder, and it's, we're told in that moment that the fury wells up, that Aeneas says, I am not the one killing you, Pallas is the one killing you, and he kills him. And then the poem actually ends with the exact same lines that Camellia, when she died, what lines were given to her about how, as she dies, her shade goes down to the underworld. And obviously the question of all questions at the end of this poem is it okay for Aeneas to kill Turnus? Is that a heroic act, or is that in fact a kind of villainous act, a cowardly act? I mean, there the guy is, Turnus has been heroic in many, many ways, very similar to, to the great warrior Aeneas in this poem. and he begs for his life. He begs for his life similarly to the way Hector begs for his life, and of course Achilles will jack Hector. It's interesting how scholars will focus, though, more on the ending of this poem and the killing of Turnus than they will on the killing of Hector at the conclusion of the fight between Achilles and Hector, for reasons that maybe we will debate in a bit. Now, as I've said to you guys about every one of these books, and I really meant it, I wish I could read every word. I just can't. I don't have the time. So let's go to work now with Book 12 and the lines. We begin with Turnus. Once Turnus, opening lines of Book 12. Once Turnus sees his ranks of Latians broken in battle, their spirits dashed, and the war god turned against them. Now is the time, he knows, for him to keep his pledge. All eyes are fixed on him. His blood is up, and nothing can quench the fighter's ardor now. Think of the lion ranging the fields near Carthage. And then we go into this amazing little word picture for about 7 lines of a lion that's been wounded and has all kinds of hunters around it, and then it's ready to fight. In other words, the poet is going to give us, obviously, the foreshadowing that we know is coming, that in the end, Turnus will be the one who dies. Of course, notice the genius of this book. Virgil is an amazing poet. The genius of this book. We begin with Turnus, we will end with Turnus, and Turnus's words here to Latinus. And he will say it at around line 15. He says, Turnus spurns all delay, he says to him. Now there's no excuse for those craven sons of Aeneas to break their word, to forsake the pact we swore. I'll take him on. I will. Bring on the sacred rites, Father. Draft out our binding terms. Either my right arm will send that Dardan down to hell, that rank deserter of Asia. My armies can sit back and watch, and Turnus's sword alone will rebut the charge of cowardice trained against them all. Or let him reign over those he's beaten down. Let Lavinia go to him, his bride. Latinus is, he's like, you know what? I really think we've other unwed girls in Latian and Laurentine fields, he says, and no mean stock at that. In other words, here's what I think, he says. Why don't you go ahead and find another girl? He admits it at line 38. I bowed to my love of you, bowed to your kindred, to our kindred blood, my wife's heart-rending tears. I broke all bonds. I tore the promised bride from her waiting groom. I brandished a wicked sword. Now, it's interesting the way he says this because, of course, it seems that he had promised his daughter to Turnus, and he had gone back against... So we don't know if he's talking about how he broke his word against Turnus, or, of course, probably broke his word against Aeneas. In other words, Latinus is saying, I was not the best of leaders in this situation. Since then, he says at 43, Turnus, you see what assaults, what crises dog my steps, what labors you have shouldered, you, first of all. Beaten twice in major battles, our city walls can scarcely harbor Italy's future hopes. The rushing Tiber still streams with our blood. The endless fields still glisten with our bones. Why do I shrink from my decision? What insanity shifts my fixed resolve? If, with Turnus dead, I'm ready to take the Trojans on as allies, why not stop the war while he's still alive? I mean, it's a great question. Let's just go ahead and resolve this thing without you having to fight, and I'll just give the peace pact, and you go find another girl to marry. What will your Rutilians, all the rest of Italy, say if I betray you to death? May fortune forbid, while you appeal for my daughter's hand in marriage. Oh, think back on the twists and turns of war. One of the reasons why we're using the Fagel's translation is, of course, he is the one that translated the opening lines of the Odyssey as twists and turns, and several times in the Aeneid we've heard this twists and turns. It's a beautiful rendering of the idea that this is the way life is, twists and turns, right? He says, pity your father, which is, of course, going to be darkly ironic, because this will be the final lines of this book. Pity your father, bent with years and grief, cut off from you and your native city are far away. In other words, he says, think about your dad. Of course, we immediately think about Pallas, who has a father named Evander, and Evander said to Aeneas, last thing I hope I hear about in my life is that you jacked Turnus for killing my boy. Turnus, you can predict this, right? At line 60, he says, no. He says, there is absolutely no way. Let me barter death as the price of fame. Or back to that word kleos again. It's Amata who will say at line 73, my son-in-law to be, Turnus, by these tears of mine, by any concern for Amata that moves your heart, you are my only hope now, sounding again very much like Hecuba at the conclusion of the Iliad when she was talking to Hector, right? You're my only hope now. You, the one relief to my wretched old age. In your hands alone the glory and power of King Latinus rests. You alone can shore our sinking house. One favor now I pray you, refrain from going hand to hand with the Trojans. Whatever dangers await you in that one skirmish, Turnus, await me too. This is ironic and darkly foreshadowing because, of course, Amata will hang herself here a little bit later. With you I will forsake the light of this life I hate, never in shackles live to see Aeneas as my son. It seems as if Amata is far more convinced to fight to the bitter end than, of course, is Latinus. And part of that obviously has to do with the goddess Juno's help, right? We're told then at line 87, as Lavinia heard her mother's pleas, Lavinia, who's been this just shadow figure in this poem, her warm cheeks bathed in tears, a blush flamed up and infused her glowing features, as crimson as Indian ivory stained with ruddy dye, or white lilies aglow in a host of scarlet roses, so mixed the hues that lit the young girl's face. Beautiful similes that Virgil will use. Turnus, struck with love, fixing his eyes upon her, fired the more for combat. We'll tell Amata briefly, don't, I beg you, mother, send me off with tears, with evil omens, as I go into the jolting shocks of war. Exactly what Hector said to Hecuba as he got ready to fight against Achilles, right? He then, Turnus will say, summon in Eidmon, the messenger, it's time, he says. Our blood, he says at line 100, will put an end to this war at last. That's the field where Lavinia must be won. Turnus then will speak to his horses, and he armors up for a second Aristia. He speaks to his spear. We're familiar with this kind of thing if we know the Iliad at all, right? And Turnus, we're told, is on fire. He's also like some bull before the fight begins that's ready to go to fight, right? Meanwhile, at line 128, we have Aeneas. At the same time, Aeneas, just as fierce in the arms his mother gave him, hones his fighting spirit too and incites his anger. Glad the war will end with the pact that Turnus offers, right? And then he says, and then he eases his friends and anxious Ilius's fears, his son's fears, explaining the ways of fate, commanding envoys now to return his firm reply to King Latinus, state the terms of peace. It's interesting that Ulysses gets mentioned here because one of the observations that has been made several times by us and of course by scholars is that although Ilius is